Thank you, Micah, for that introduction. And, it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say thank you to the SCU first, Robert Powell, Rich Hoffman, Morgan Beal, for taking a chance and let me stand up here and present my findings for my dissertation. Before we get started, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are mine and do not reflect the views or positions of the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the United States intelligence community. And since I'm on active duty, I need to make that point clear. So this is what we're going to cover today. First, I'm going to start with a brief introduction of who I am. I think that's important because I'm relatively new to the UAP field. I got started in around 2018, had a little bit of a road bump in there, which we're going to cover in my bio slide, and is now culminated with this dissertation. After I introduce who I am, we're going to cover my problem statement, my purpose statement, where I start framing out not only what it is that I'm trying to solve, but also the method in which I attempted to solve it. We're going to spend quite a bit of time in the methodology, because what is extremely important, especially in the intelligence community, is you have to explain your methodology. It has to make sense. You have to be able to follow my logical sequence. So I say that so that way if somebody comes behind me and tries to replicate it, they can pick up my work, do the same thing, and then we can argue about the findings. And that's what's important, is that the logical process is what matters the most. After that, I'm going to go over my findings and my conclusions, offer some recommendations to practitioners, policymakers, and those currently researching the topic, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. All right, so who am I? A little bit about myself. I'm an active duty U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer 4. I have 24 years of service, and I've been deployed several times, Afghanistan, Iraq, the usual suspects. Got 3 deployments under my belt in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've spent a lot of times in the Philippines, Thailand, Japan, Guam, Korea, around the world. So I've got a wide array, or a diverse background of experience with other cultures, which I think is important in understanding how to maintain humility when you approach a problem. I'm currently stationed at Fort Liberty, used to be known as Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, that's in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I'm a counterintelligence agent. So by trade, I investigate national security crimes. So what does that mean, right? Insider threat, that's the buzzword we hear. To really break it down to brass tacks, I try to find the spy. Not necessarily attempting to recruit a spy, I'm trying to find them. And that's the crux of what I do. The other aspect of what we do in CI is we attempt to prove a negative. Right? How do you prove that someone is conducting espionage without having to dig into a whole lot of background, gather a whole lot of data? Interestingly enough, it seems to share the same commonalities that you would with going after UAP, right? It's just a lot of negative data that keeps coming back. That being said, best way to look at it, I'm a professional gossip. Go around, try to talk to people, get them to tell me stuff. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But, at the end of the day, when people are like, what do you do for a living? Well, I gossip about other things, and we see how it goes. I'm a cancer survivor. In August 2022, I was diagnosed with squamous cell carcinoma. I had a cancerous tumor in my right nasal cavity, had to undergo 5 weeks of chemo, underwent a 10-hour surgery to remove the tumor, and then I had to get 50 radiation treatments straight to the head to make sure that it didn't come back. So that was part of the journey for going through this dissertation. And if you look to the left, you'll see some pictures there where I'm in the hospital, like in the upper left, and just beneath the one on the upper left, to where I'm sitting there trying to read UAP reports as either just going into chemo or just coming out of it. So around that time is when I had to take a break, let the treatment cycle run its process. In February, I completed treatment. And I picked up the dissertation again that March. So March 2023 is when I picked it up and started plugging forward. And my kids have got stories about where they had to come on in and poke me to wake me up, because I would be reading the cases, trying to code them, and then, start falling asleep on yourself. So they enjoyed it. It became a game for them. I'm a husband and a father. I've been married 19 years. We just celebrated our 19th wedding anniversary in May. I have an 18-year-old named Jaden. She's looking at attending Belmont Abbey here in the near future. And I have a 14-year-old named Christina who said her lot in life is she wants to send stuff to Mars. Now, that's what she told me today. We'll see if that changes, and I hope she doesn't hold me accountable for what I just said right there. My academic credentials. So one of the shortcomings within the intel domain is it's a profession, it's a practice. How do you teach how to think within something that what you do is practice it. So American Military University has an excellent bachelor's degree in intelligence studies. That's where I started my, my journey on fulfilling, on taking my professional life and joining it to my academic life. And each of these degrees helped for me to better understand the problem that I'm trying to solve within my professional life. So after I got the bachelor's degree, I graduated in 2013, and then I took 6 months off and went and got a master's in strategic security and protection management from Henley Putnam. After that, I got the doctorate in strategic security in December 2023, and National American Universities who awarded it. Now the difference is I have a DSS, not a PhD. Why that's important is that with a DSS, it's a professional degree that is designed to solve a problem through applied practice. So, and that's important. We start making that delineation between those who have the Doctor of Philosophy, which focuses on different ways of thinking about problems. I'm focused on what we can do to solve them. And so essentially, I think what's great about being part of the SCU is that with the PhDs I work with, we're able to find innovative ways of solving problems as they're thinking about what these problems look like. I became the National Security Advisor to the SCU in the summer of 2023. Prior to that, I occupied a limited advisory role as the intelligence advisor. We couldn't really frame out what it was supposed to do. I couldn't spend a lot of time on trying to figure out what it was because I was working on the dissertation. And so after I graduated, and Rich reached out, and I was like, "Yes, sir. I want to be on board. I want to continue trying to fight the good fight to shed some light on what it is that is this phenomenon that we face." All right. So, what was the impetus for the dissertation? Right. I don't have an experience or story. I don't have an encounter story. Really, my familiarity with UAP at the time was when it was UFO, and I've approached. I made one of my non-negotiables is go into things with your mind wide open. That's important. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I bought into the stigma, but I also didn't use the term believe, right? It was just something that was there, not really something I was interested in. So I started looking at social movement theory, and I got bored quick. It's an interesting subject. There's a lot of data out there on it, a lot of published reports, and one of the things you learn when you're writing a dissertation is make sure you're passionate, because you're going to be reading a lot of stuff. And if you're not passionate, find something else. It's okay to go back to the drawing board and find something you're passionate about. So I was talking to a friend of mine, Dr. Joe Donato, and over a couple whiskeys, I was like, "Hey, look, I can't keep moving on with social movement theory. Like it's interesting, but nobody's going to read this thing. And at the end of it, I'm done checking blocks. Like, so what do you think?" And he goes, "Have you considered UAP as a national security problem?" And I was like, "Come on, UFOs? Like, okay, all right. So explain to me how it's a national security problem." And he sat me down and spelled out a few cases, those cases that we would consider to be, to provide evidence of a problem, specifically the 2004 Nimitz encounter. And that was where it started. I said, okay, so this does look like this could be a national security problem. We are assuming risk, that we don't know what that risk is. And I hesitate to use the word threat. And I'm going to get to a slide to where we talk about threat and why I hesitate to use that word. And so I said, okay, we have a risk here. So the next question was, what is the problem? And so after talking with Joe, I was introduced to Rich Hoffman. And to Rich's credit, I walk up and I said, "Hey, Rich, I'm Josh, new to this UFO thing. Like, is this a legitimate field of study? Are there people who actually do this?" And Rich took the time to spell out his story from when he was 15 years old and got the D+ to where he is now, and some of the groundbreaking things that he's doing to draw attention to this topic within Congress, all the way through, and said, yes, it is a legitimate field of study. So Rich told me a story, and it was instrumental in changing my thought process. So after that point, I picked up Larry Hancock's book, Unidentified: The National Intelligence Problem of UFOs. If you have not read this, Larry's approach in that book is how I look at the problem. It was critical to framing out that this might be our problem. right? It's not just a problem that people talk about from time to time and look at, and it's kind of anecdotal, and the term anomalous gets thrown around a lot, but it is our problem. The next book after that was Leslie Kean's book, which I think most of us are familiar with. How much of a problem is it? Well, after reading that book, it's a big problem. And I think that the case that stood out in that book was, I believe it was the Peruvian Air Force pilot who took a shot at a UAP and it absorbed the rounds. And that's when it became that this is a big problem. This isn't just something that can be solved by a little bit of observation, maybe some scratch work on a pad and we move on. No, something is exhibiting, and I won't say is exhibiting a capability that we don't seem to understand. Moving on from that, I then picked up Robert Powell and Michael Swords' tome. I've read that book twice. That is one I would recommend that you use as a reference. And it was instrumental in defining the question, has the problem existed over time? And it was because of Robert Powell and Michael Swords' extensive work on the Foo Fighters in World War II that I was able to determine that Kenneth Arnold's case is not the first time that this has been a problem, and it's not the first time it's interacted with what we would call the national security state. So then after going, taking a couple months to read all this and starting on a couple research proposals, fleshing it out, working through the problem, I go to Katie Beth and I said, okay, I'm going to just present you with something and you let me know what you think. So I presented her, everything that I had learned at that point from start to finish, and she looks at me and goes, it looks like you have a problem. And then that's when I got to the problem statement. To the right is a certificate of dissertation approval. I was told to say this next line by my wife, so I'm going to. This is a seminal work in the regard that the last academic paper that I could find where it looked at tangible material aspects of UAP was in 1967, published by an Air Force officer for his time in what is deemed intermediate leadership education, or Command and General Staff College. So from that point to this dissertation, most of the work that I've been able to find on the topic has focused on collective pathology, psychological implications. Is it angels and demons? That has been the primary focus of the dissertations and theses since 1967. Interestingly enough, we all know what happened between 67 and 69 when we got that excellent work out of the University of Colorado at Boulder, when Dr. Edward Condon stated that there is no threat and we shouldn't care about what it is because science can't solve it. That was sarcasm, if anybody needs me to put a plug in there for that. So moving on, I do want to take a second to thank my committee, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this part, but this is important because they took a risk. Academia, we were all seeing that academia may not be ready for this, right? And so, but they took a risk. Dr. Herb Kemp was my committee chair, spent a lot of time framing out that problem statement and helping me get through how to get through the dissertation process. And he even went back and told me in 2022, brother, you need to collect more data. You don't have enough yet. And so I went from 300 cases and expand the sample to 20,000. And so we're going to talk about how I pared that down. Dr. Eric Davis was my subject matter expert, critical in framing what it was we were looking for, that I didn't just get lost in the data and lost in the phenomenology of what people were reporting. It was helpful in ensuring that I stayed pointed in the right direction and just didn't start going on a wayward path and starting to move in a conspiratorial direction with what it could be, but to keep it focused on what the data states. And Dr. Nyman was excellent for underpinning what it was that Dr. Davis was stating. And so these three members took a risk and put their names on this dissertation for it to be published. And Dr. Burke, the dean of the university, the support she's provided since I was in my graduate degree led to this as well. So this wouldn't have happened if they weren't ready and willing to take a risk with this dissertation. All right, so what's the problem? Now let's get to why we're here. So what's the problem? First bullet, I think we can all pretty much agree that that's the problem, and we've seen it. over time, UAP penetrates sovereign airspace and sea space, right? Like that is the problem that I'm looking to try and develop. UAP penetrate these with impunity. We can do nothing about it. It just does it. We observe it. Sometimes it gets cataloged, sometimes it doesn't. Life goes on. Science and government communities lack cohesion, and this may not. And I can go through the data sets that indicate the problems with how that particular bullet is phrased. The point that I'm trying to get here is when I have to start with an assumption. Instead of posting blame, I have to start with what is a key assumption that I can make. A, government looked into UAP. We can state that. B, there doesn't appear to be an interest for government and the scientific communities to link up. There might be attempts, but that interest may not be there. So that was one of my key assumptions. The lack of cohesion has caused the problem to not be answered. Third, UAP is phenomenological, right? So it's rich for structured analytic techniques. The majority of my work is a phenomenological study in my professional life, right? So there's quite a bit of similarities there. So it's rich for using the techniques that I was brought up in the Intel community, which are all unclassified and all listed as references at the end of my dissertation on how to look at the problem the way that I looked at the problem. So now let's get to, does it pose a threat? This is a commonly discussed topic. It seems to be the one thing that is often discussed when we talk about UAP. UAP threat UAP. They're conjoined. For some reason, there's a relationship there, and we don't really know why. It could be an implicit bias. It could be a collective bias. But for some reason, those two continue to be linked. Governments have a history of attempting to determine threat. That is true, not only with UAP, but with other things. That is the intention and purpose of government. How can we mitigate risk to the population, right? That is a starting point. If we cut away the deception and the noise surrounding the problem, the overarching intent of government should be to reduce the threat to their population and to achieve their national interests. So let's define threat. Threat requires two things, capability and intent. When we look at the UAP problem, we have we have data that addresses capability, and we have anecdotal evidence that addresses intent, right? And so to understand if something poses a threat, you need both capability and intent. So capability is the means to do something, like you have the tech, you have the process, you are able to impose something upon an entity. Intent is the desire to impose whatever that is on an entity. So we have anecdotal evidence of intent, we have evidence of capability. And then action I put on the outside of the parenthetical because if action is taken, it is also a data point to better understand capability and intent. So essentially the two elements you need to understand threat is capability and intent. Without them, you're sitting at risk. What risk is posed by the presence and interaction of the phenomena with the human with the population? And so what do structured analytic techniques offer? They offer a method of defining that threat, right? And so what I'm going to talk about is the one that I was successful in using, analysis for competing hypotheses, and the one that I couldn't use, scenarios and indications, and why I couldn't use scenarios and indications for this dissertation. So here's what I did, right? So my objectives were to survey and analyze and enrich available data sets. There's a lot of data out there on UAP. Newfork, MUFON, NICAP, the Hatch database, and I know I'm leaving some others off. So what did I try to do? I tried to find another way to look at the data that is already present in those databases. On top of using those databases, I also looked at published works, published books to round out where I was extrapolating the cases. So then I attempted to ID and evaluate signature criteria and associated patterns. So UAP would present something, it would emit something, and then I would see if it had a pattern with other UAP cases. So, for example, we always see UAP or for one, UAP and beam emission. Did it look like a beam was emitted? Okay, well, how many times was the beam emitted? And so in my data matrix, I went through each case that met curation standards and just put a little check mark for beam emission, and then that's how I got to, is there an associated pattern with beam emission in UAP? And then it had to be observable and detectable, right? So understanding that the human sensor is a means of detection, may not be the best means of detection, but it's still a means of detection. I took those 2 points. It was observed either through a technical means or through an individual, and it could be detected, meaning that there's potential for me to give it to a scientist and say, can you build a sensor array that can answer this problem? And that is a common process within the Intel community. It's called fusion, right? It's in Robert Clark's book, Intelligence Analysis, a Target-Centric Approach. And so I applied a curation standard. There were 6 rules to my curation. They range from having to have 2 sources and 3 signatures to how I define primary source and why I had to eliminate CE3 protocol, which I will get to why I had to eliminate that in a subsequent slide. All these observations had to be were already reported. I had to be able to extrapolate them from a reference that is generally accepted as reputable. And I use the term general because no matter what you publish, somebody's going to argue it, so generally accepted. And I derived my cases from 16 sources. I then organized the testimonies from the references based on exclusionary criteria, right? So I was running 2 databases. I was running a data matrix and I was running a reference matrix. And those 2 databases is how I ensured that the sources of the information were credible and were reliable, and that the data was credible. And then I analyzed for the most reported observations, and that's how I ended up with the pie charts, the graphs, and the maps, and all the stuff that I used to determine the findings. So how did I limit myself? I didn't conduct any interviews. The primary reason why I didn't conduct any interviews was I was pressed for time with getting an institutional review board done, a review board requirement done. Understandably so, given the 7-year window you have to complete this, and I was buttressing right up against it. So how I handled that particular problem is Dr. Jacques Vallée made a key point. We need to look for primary sources. That's my job in the Intel community. So if I could find if the individual or the method in which the report was captured, I could identify primary source, I used it. And then I looked at common cases with signatures, of common signatures with UAP encounters at national security sites. What's key here is that was my initial starting point for me to try and write out comparable data with other UAP cases. When I initially started, I was looking specifically at national security sites. But then as I was running through the iterative process of data collection, it popped in my head. I was confirming a personal bias that UAP may only be interested in national security sites, and that seems to be an underlying problem that we have today. We're always only focused on artifacts and elements of national security. And I think a lot of that has to do with how capturing information from those who encounter UAP has been conducted throughout the years. We're all aware of the stigma. And over time, you start looking for highly credible sources. And when you get those highly credible sources, that is now used as an aha moment. And I think that that's really what's happened. And so my goal here was to not have that affect this dissertation. So I opened the aperture. And then testimonies had to have at least 2 sources. And so two sources could be defined as 2 people. It could be defined as a person and an object, right? So for example, in one case that I reviewed, a pilot encountered a UAP, wasn't able to pick it up on radar, but when he landed, he had a green substance on his wing. Now, there could be some causation or some correlation or what, to me, it looks like a relationship at a minimal. UAP sighting occurs, not able to detect it on radar prior to the aircraft taking off. There's no green stuff. Come back, now there's green stuff on the wing. Now, due diligence was not done. Evidence was not collected. However, what it does is it gives us a means to point and go, see, that's evidence. We should collect that. Somebody needs to go and do what they need to do, see what they can grab off of that wing, because it was a green substance that was glowing. That's important. But instead, what happened is, plane was rolled into the hangar, and then that was the end of it. Report was taken, and life goes on. So here was my research question, right? It's a bit of a mouthful, right? So is a dissertation title. I think all dissertation titles are they lean towards that direction. So do research questions in some ways. What common measurement data or technical signatures exist among multiple UAP encounters that are detectable, right? That's essentially, what is a signature, attribute, or characteristic that people are seeing in their reporting that may offer a means of detectability with the right technical tools. Sub-question 1, I could not answer because we don't have much data on environment, and I want to do a plug for that database that the SCU is doing. They're able to start looking at the environment as well. I can tell you, if I had that product 2 years ago, my results would have been much more refined. Everything I had to do was through analog. And so looking at sub-question 1, the primary, the most consistent data point was it was either day or night, and it was either hot or cold, cloudy or sunny. Sometimes somebody talked about rain. And that's all I got. But sub-question 1 derives from the thought process that there may be a correlation between UAP presence and significant changes in weather, right? And so if that exists, if that is a thing, then sub-question 1 holds merit. I couldn't use it based on current data sets. Most cases, as we know, are pithy 3 to 5 line statements. Doesn't give you much. Sub-question 2, what characteristics are commonly associated with phenomenological incidents that are possibly measurable and identifiable? That one I was able to answer, and that's what you're going to see in subsequent slides. All right, so these are my objectives. Identify UAP cases that offer a means that essentially meet the definition of requiring further scrutiny. There's a lot of noise in the databases, and so you have to build a curation standard to get through it. And that curation standard is what informed my data collection objectives. So I would say these are my measures of performance for the dissertation, right? If I met these 5 steps, then I could move on to what would be my measures of effectiveness, findings and conclusions. So determine which UAP signatures are there and then code them, And so again, was I able to complete that? I implemented a curation standard and I established a method of tracking both the cases and the references, and then I input the signatures into the database. And for the cases that I excluded, were input into another database with the reason for exclusion. So I'd say I met my measures of performance. Okay, so this is the current process of documentation that I discovered while doing my research. Phenomenological event occurs. The witness provides testimony into some database of sorts, or maybe calls somebody. It's published, and then no scrutiny is applied. And so you end up with, I think New Fork is at 127,000 UAP reports. Again, that is not against a ding for the work New Fork is doing. It's extremely important, but what is important to take away from this is that quantity does not always equal quality. And oftentimes we throw out the number between 2 and 5, maybe up to 7% are cases that actually require further scrutiny. And so, and this essentially is a product of I would say is stigmas that have been applied to reporting. We've had to spend more time collecting data to demonstrate that something is happening than we could analyzing what was happening to determine what it is. So what I did is I came up with a process I came up with a methodology of how I was going to do it, or how I would do it if I was running a database and I had unlimited funds and resources and was able to dispatch people over the world. This is essentially what it would look like. We'd examine the testimonies, or prior to that, go collect the data, examine the testimonies, and then we'd have a curation standard that we would apply while identifying the most credible sources or the most reliable sources and credible information. I got those two words switched up in the presentation. Now, for this particular methodology, I had to develop this on the fly and go back to my subject, or to go back to both my subject matter expert and my committee chair to make sure that I wasn't applying a different standard each time. And the reason why is we don't necessarily have a strong curation standard within the field of UAP research, right? And since I was starting at 0, goals to get to 1, there's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that I was going to make it to 1. And so the curation standard was essentially developed while evaluating sources. And then after I had the curation standard set, I went back to square one and evaluated all the sources again. So that way, if somebody picks up my dissertation and wants to replicate it, they can do it as well. And then I reviewed the testimonies and applied a structured analytic technique. All right, so here's the 4 steps that went through as to how I went through my methodology. Went through 16 references. 3 databases were part of those 16 references. The others were various books on the topic that had UAP cases in them. I ended up surveying 20,000 testimonies. That could seem hyperbolic, but again, New Fork has a database of 127,000. So it just means I spent a lot of time going through a lot of cases to try and determine those that would meet a curation standard. And so I pared it down to 2,368. Those 2,368 initially had 2 sources. That's what I was looking for first, was 2 sources, and could I place the anomalous event in space and time? If I could place it in space and time, meaning date, time, location, and 2 sources were present, it went to a separate database for me to go back and check after I got through the 20,000 report survey. After that, 1,684 were excluded and 684 were deemed to be an actual case, which is an event worthy of further scrutiny. And then in my reference database, I applied a numbering system relating to the reference. And so we'll see on a subsequent slide what that looks like. And then I derived all those testimonies from the 16 sources. Going through my curation, if it was no and excluded, I gave a reason for exclusion. And why this is important is frequently we are called to question why we remove particular cases. This exclusionary criteria then explains why. And I have a slide depicting what were the exclusionary criteria. I then coded them for the cases that met curation standards. They were coded in a code book. Like I said, all this was analog until I actually digitized it onto the computer. So there's little field note journals. I've got 15 of them that have each of these 684 cases written out with the signatures, the date, time, location, duration. You know, ran through a lot of pens, a lot of paper. You know, it was fun times. So after it was coded, then it was placed into the data matrix. Again, running two matrices. One's reference, one's data. And then those that didn't meet it were excluded, and I provided a reason. And so what was my product on the end? And it informed the analysis. Ended up being graphs and pie charts. I depicted some on a map, and what you'll see in the map when we get there is that it's not color coordinated. It was limited by the product I had available to. Too bad SCU didn't have their map up yet, but you know, that's okay. I've already asked them if I can take my data, toss it into their database, and then get it depicted on their map and update the slide. And then also the date, time, location, and duration, were depicted in the database, and it was also analyzed to see if there were cluster areas. What I'll say is when you look at the map, cluster areas, it's not necessarily a finding that came out of my dissertation because it was 684 cases on a global scale. There's really not much that you can call a cluster area off of that. We'd need more data. And so this is just the line and block chart of the slide that I discussed previously. Create a repository, identify the reports of UAP by reference, run it through a curation standard. If it meets it, it goes through the process on the left. If it doesn't, it goes through the process on the right. I'm going to pause here so people can take a look at that for a second. Okay, moving on. So these were the references surveyed. This is only by author. If I'd have put the title on here, it wouldn't have fit. But if I could draw your attention to Jerome Clark, this is a UAP encyclopedia. It's his 3rd edition. There were 170 reports that I found in that encyclopedia. Excellent work. If you want to spend time on knowing the history and those key cases, this is a good work to look at. Of those 170, 84 met the curation standard that I set. 86 did not and were excluded. And so you can see how I did that for each one of those particular references. And so when I say somebody can come behind me and check my work, this is what they'd be checking. The beauty is we can even debate cases and how to open up the curation standard, include more. So with both databases set, we have a means of going through each of those and determining, which is a good case and which should remain excluded. All right, so this is my exclusionary criteria. Single source, meaning one individual reporting, or even if it's a technical capability that captured something, but it wasn't observed until a period of time passed. And I get it, period of time can be relative, but if too much time passed and somebody said, yeah, I had a radar return, and it's hard to make that determination, so I excluded it. Less than 3 signatures, 2 sources, only had 2 signatures, and that's key because one of the points is, and I know I'm gonna catch some stuff from my law enforcement buddies, but a while back I remember reading a study that when you look at, if you're a witness to a crime, you have roughly 6 to 8 seconds to observe, process, categorize, and capture what it is you're seeing that individual do. What we'll see in a subsequent slide is UAP stick around. And so if it's sticking around longer than 6 seconds, your brain has time to capture that data and process and categorize it. So that's why if you only had 2 signatures, we can't determine if it's a UAP. I think 3 is a little low, but given that I had to use 2 sources and I was hard on 2 sources, I had to have some latitude on the signatures. No source provided. If it was just a statement in a database or in a book and it didn't say anything about how the information was garnered, it was tossed. CE3 encounter is the most interesting, I would say, of the exclusionary criteria. So close encounter 1 protocol, as most of us know, is you observe a UAP. You encounter something phenomenological. Close encounter 2, the anomaly leaves some sort of trace that it was there. Close encounter 3 is something with biologics, right? So the individual or individuals had an encounter with something that we would deem, a biological entity. Those 75 cases had 2 sources. I had to exclude them, not because the people in academia are not ready, but because academia is not yet ready to discuss that particular issue as an institution, right? So that's important when we look at that particular exclusion. 2 sources were present for those 75 cases. So one of my future works is going to be to go back, look at those 75 cases, stick them in the data set, see what comes out. Multiple reference, same case, self-explanatory. And this is one of the key points. There's a lot of time, cleaning up the data, I guess. Have a lot of cases, need to make sure that they're all, that I'm not, reporting on the same thing over and over and over, not including the same case in the data set over and over and over. No location identified, no date identified. There's controversy in reports, another one. So these are all, if I couldn't deem it as having a certain level of quality and efficacy, it had to go. And this was my methodology for how I analyzed UAP signatures. It was a lot. I ended up with 42. And so that's a lot of correlative data to look at how various signatures relate to each other. And so, I had to pare it down, had to come up with a process, and that's where the funnel comes in. I took those signatures and I organized them into profile groups. And those profile groups were as close as I could get them as they related to each other. And then after I put them in the profile groups, I started with classifying the shape signature by 4 main shapes. I ended up with 12 to 15 different shapes. But again, if I would have broken it out by 12 to 15 different shapes, I would have been left with a data set that I couldn't analyze. So the two primary reported shapes were discs and triangles. The others were put into the all other shapes category, or the combined shapes category. Again, we can manipulate the data set to analyze it differently, but that was how I was able to provide an analytical product on the back end of what it is we might be looking at. And then I put them on a map graphic, which will be displayed in subsequent slides. So these are my conclusions. Finding one is pretty profound. They're observable through aided and unaided means. You can see a UAP. You can encounter one. It's not a collective pathology. They occur most often at night. We could talk about the myriad of factors for why that is, but it's most frequently when they're encountered. They range from having a presence to a few seconds to several days. But what is interesting is that we often talk about, well, it could be anything. Like, how do you know? And something lingering between 1 and 59 minutes that is exhibiting a form of non-propulsive positive lift. That's pretty profound, right? Like, so like, what are we saying that everything that does that is a weather balloon? I mean, it really calls into question a lot of things that we hear from the skeptical community on this. Is all of this calls for question, right? The least common was a continuous presence, which was 8+ hours. Some cases on that. Don't ask me to name how many off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and manipulate the data set to say that. But there were a few to where they just maintained a presence. But again, it's lingering for a period of time to where your brain can process what it's seeing and then state what it is you think, for you to provide what the signature may be of that. So with proper interview techniques, that can be extrapolated in a manner that we can use it to conduct analysis. And it's observed by a diverse population. It's not a bunch of farmers sitting in the Midwest. It's not, somebody who lives in the hill. No, it ranges from pilots to the general public and everything in between. So this isn't limited. So if it's a diverse population, it calls into question this idea of collective pathology, right? Is everybody in that population base crazy that observes a UAP? Again, it's a unique issue that everybody from all walks of life are encountering. Finding 5 is speaking to the national security implications. I looked at a broad spectrum of reports, right? And so what I derived in finding 5 is that UAP may not be particularly focused on only national security. It may be an element of importance, but when we start talking about intent, the reports don't necessarily correlate that intention is only to focus on national security. It's involved in, there's encounters often occurring within the general public. The original 12 signatures proposed by the U.S. government were not the most often reported or collected. Now, the U.S. government may be looking at other things, no issue, but I made an assumption on finding 6 was that the U.S. government was looking at would be the most reported signatures, not necessarily so. The data set refuted that. And then finding 7, when we talk about analysis of competing hypotheses, I think in the subsequent slide, I'm going to read this one off. Analysis of competing hypotheses supports that UAP indicates a technology beyond the scope of current material science capabilities and is not owned by the U.S. or foreign competitor. So we don't know who has it. We know it's out there. And that's looking at the pattern starting in 1942 to present day. That we don't know, we can't say with a level of determination that somebody owns this within our understanding of the nation state ideal, but it's exhibiting a technological capability. Okay, so this is my math for analysis of competing hypotheses. Best way for me to put this. Now, I'm not like Dr. Knuth to where I can dev out how awesome it was to understand his approach to algorithms, but this is what we use in the Intel field, a little bit easier for me to understand, right? So, in analysis of competing hypotheses, we even have liberty with the use of terms, right? So it says ACH because in traditional analysis of competing hypotheses, step 1A would be, what are your hypotheses? However, since using the scientific process, I didn't have a null hypothesis. I essentially had nothing but a lot of data, right? So without a null hypothesis, I have to figure out a way to make sure that I can run it through a structured analytic technique. So I changed the term and said, we're going to call it a scenario outcome. And I had 4 scenario outcomes, which we'll see in the subsequent slide. And those are listed as scenarios A, B, and C. Then I have to identify key assumptions. And key assumptions inform what your scenario outcomes are. So, as you develop your scenario outcomes, you're developing what it is that to be true, to be factual, and what you can assume off of those facts. And then you move to step 2, where you start identifying evidence, and that's an iterative process. That's data collection, right? And then in steps 3 and 4, you're assessing the evidence for diagnostic attributes, right? And so that means which evidence stands a scrutiny. Does it meet a curation standard? If it meets a curation standard, you can keep it for steps 5 and 6, or you can eliminate it. And then moving to steps 5 and 6 is when you start eliminating your hypotheses. In my case, it would be scenarios based on the evidence presented, and identify linchpin evidence. Linchpin evidence gets a higher weighted value than regular evidence. And again, this is all judgment, right? Oftentimes in the Intel field, we are left with a lot more gaps than we have information to fill those gaps. So we spend a lot of time rendering judgment. Intelligence Community Directive 203, which talks about analytic standards. You can find it on the ODNI website, publicly available, discusses how we approach making these types of assessments, right? And so when we look at the evidence narrative, E1 would be evidence piece 1. If it meets scenario A, or it shows that it supports scenario A, it gets a plus. If it shows that and as you see, it doesn't support scenario B, it gets a minus. Doesn't support scenario C, gets a minus. You look at E2, under scenario C, it says not applicable. That means the evidence has no value, either positive or negative, to that particular scenario. And then when you look down to the outcome below, that's essentially when you add up the pluses and the minuses and the linchpin evidence, and then you come up with your answer. And whichever one has the highest number, that's what the scenario outcome, the assessed scenario outcome is. So essentially, it's basic math, but this is what we're able to do to pare down a lot of different analytical issues and to apply a standard to make sure that what we're stating can be backed up with the process. So instead of reading these off, I'm going to pause for a bit so you can take time to read these. But these are my scenario, my outcomes, and my key assumptions. And I have no issues providing these if you want to see them, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right, so these are all the signatures. This is kind of a busy slide, but essentially what I'm showing you here is that we talk about signatures. The way that I had to look at it, and this is how we look at it in the intelligence field, is it exhibiting something that can be detected, or is it exhibiting something that we may have a means of possible detection in the future? Now, I didn't have a scientist sitting next to me for me to be able to poke and go, hey, can we detect orbit? Are we able to look at, to develop some neat whiz-bang object that can, get me distances between objects as they're rotating around each other? Can you do it in real time? So I did have to take some creative license as I was going through to catalog what is a signature here. Some of these may also be attributes, but this is when people say UAP, this is what they're observing. And so I took those signatures, and as you see, I put them through the profile groups, and then a came out on the end with the shape categories. Yep. Sorry, wrong way. Okay, so now we're going to talk about link diagrams, right? This is a tool we use in the intelligence community frequently to try and build networks, to try and understand things. You know, again, the process of using a link diagram, there's some publicly available websites I use to build these things. This is PowerPoint. But what we're looking at here is the red is the signature, the blue are those that are associated with the signature. So in subsequent slides, that's what we're going to see. All right, so what's important here is this slide defines, when people say they saw a UAP, this defines what they mean, right? UAPs glow, they're transmedium. You know, there's some sort of inherent interference that's been reported. You know, on electrical platforms and motor-driven platforms, they're observable for a pretty substantial block of time. When they engage, they conduct erratic maneuvers. Sometimes they emit a beam, and then they may materialize, dematerialize, cloak, however we want to define low observable, that's what happens. They can also maintain a presence for days. They can move from stasis to speed. These things are fast and slow all at the same time, and while they're going from stasis to speed, they can change direction on a dime, right? There's a positive lift aspect to them. You know, there's colors that they present when they're reported. There's a prolonged stasis, which means in that prolonged stasis, again, as it remains, it demonstrates a capability to remain in a location for a period of time. And with shape, these are the four primary shapes after I had to pare them down as to how they were grouped. There were originally 12. But these are the four when I put it through the combined shape process or through the shape analysis process that were used. So these are reported UAP encounters. 1940s, we can see it starting a little bit, and then it picks up in 50s. We're all aware of 1952, the year of the UFO. And then there's a dip. That dip seems to coincide with the Condon report. Just leave it at that. And then it picks up again in the 2000s, and then when you see in 2020s, we don't have just not a lot of data yet for the 2020s. So that's why that could also account for the drop at the end, and also the data we have for current UAP cases in the NICAP chronology, which is what I had to use specific for the 2020 piece. It was NICAP, Lukotsky's book, and the UFO case or the SCU case studies. So we just don't have a lot of data for what's out there yet. And then below is what we can see as the number of cases reported over time, and that time is based off of the local time. So where the UAP was reported. And this is the map graphic I was talking about. That if we had if the SCU had their spreadsheet up and their map graphic up, this would be looking a lot better. Those colors do not correlate to anything. I tried to do it by shape. It didn't work. Limited for time and not wanting to spend, the $200-300 that were being asked for me to get a map graphic that did that. I took chance with my committee and said, hey, if I just put a little asterisk that says colors mean nothing, can we go with that? And they all agreed. So, but this is where people are saying they observe UAPs. What's interesting is that gap in China and Russia. There's a lot of speculation there. One of the things we need to remember is that China and Russia are authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments are prone to suppression of information. That can be a key point. When we say triangle, this is what we mean. The picture in the middle is derived off the internet, but it's anonymous posted, so it's anonymous credibility or credited to an anonymous creator. But that is essentially what people are seeing with triangles in present day. Matte black object with a grid-like structure. What's interesting about that grid-like structure is that those who are reporting on that grid-like structure state that they see fluid moving through it. But again, when people say triangle, this is what they mean. Now, again, I'm relatively new to the UAP field, but this looks like the start of a taxonomy that we often talk about of how, what is UAP? Well, here's a definition. And the thing is that this doesn't have to be the right definition. It's a starting point to develop the right definition. This is why I have no issues with people checking my work. Triangles, what I thought was an interesting finding, data was not available that addressed a transmedium capability. They stayed within our, within our atmosphere. They also deployed a lot of objects, and those objects glowed. They buried themselves in the earth. And when people went to go find these objects that were buried in the earth, and they'd point and go, yeah, it was right there. And they dig up the ground, there's nothing there, right? So that's key. That's interesting. It responds to interaction. It'll pace a vehicle, pace an aircraft, emit a beam. It causes physiological responses. People have reported to have time loss when triangles are present, have radiation burns, radiation sickness whenever this particular phenomena is around. It remains in stasis for a while. The discernible features, there's aperture in the middle. It's common. Over how many times triangles were reported, there was always an aperture in the middle and 3 lights on the perimeter. It also appeared to move to move in its development process. First, we see these delta wings, and then it moves to this lumbering, gray, slow-moving, kind of move fast object in the sky, to a shiny black object, to a matte black object, to now a matte black object with a grid-like structure. That looks like an acquisitions process or a research and development process to me, right? I don't know. It's susceptible to radar detection. Often in the triangle reports, there would be a cue on the radar, but it would obfuscate that detection through maneuvers, meaning it'd move around. And so once it would pick up, it's detected, and then it would start doing stasis to speed and the zigzag movements and make those erratic maneuvers almost as though it's trying to shake off the fact that it's been detected. And there's a noise association. What is interesting about the noise association with the triangle is that it's inside the observer's head. It may not be heard by anybody else around, but inside the observer is when they'll hear that inner ear pitch or a drum beat, or everything goes quiet, and it may just be that one particular observer. So in a couple cases, you'd have 2 sources. One's hearing the inner ear pitch, the other one hears nothing, right? That's interesting, if anything. First report in triangles was 1943, and then a sharp decline until 1965. Oh, I thought my next slide was my graphic. That's okay. This is the map. Oh, I went the wrong way again. I'll figure this out by the end of the presentation, right? So this is the graphic for triangle cases, right? I essentially had 2 sources that I could use. One was Dave Marler's, and then the other one was a gentleman whose name I've forgotten who wrote about the triangle UAP in Europe, right? So that's why it doesn't seem like there's a lot of, it's not a proliferated issue. It seems to be isolated. Could be a lack of reporting. What's interesting is this was the most reported signature with 184 times, or the most reported shape. Okay, and so now here's the graphic that I was referring to. On the top, we see the number of cases. We see this, there's a few cases. I mean, in the year of the UAP, we had less than 10. So 1952, less than 10 triangle cases. Then it drops to close to nothing in the 60s, and then it starts to spike and kind of goes on a bump. It looks like a lot of research and development. That's at least what was my takeaway. On the bottom, we have the time of reported encounters. It really likes the nighttime, that 2000 to 2300 time frame, that 4-hour block. Really likes that particular time. Okay, and so now this is a disk. So when people say disk, this is what they're reporting. Again, the low observables are present. It impacts the livelihood. We can discuss the efficacy of the Caleres event. At the end of the day, multiple encounters reported by a wide array of people, a diverse population that ended up with radiation burns and cancer, and there was physical evidence of the encounter. I'm not here to judge whether or not I believe what they say. I am here especially using my experience and wisdom in 24 years in doing counterintelligence to accept their testimony and use it as an evaluation criteria. So that's why Caleres is in here, is because it was a disk event. to where these issues happened. Also has a low observable capability. It has a negative response to interaction. It'll try and shake off observers by blinding them with a beam. It'll move rapidly in the vicinity of the observer, or as opposed to triangles, it would just take off away from the observer. Discs stick around, move around a little bit, and then take off. It also paced vehicles or aircraft too. Seems to be a little bit more sinister with discs and triangles. I know there could be some debate on that, but the discs really seem to push on that pacing mechanism. It emits a sound. The difference between discs and triangles is that when the sound was heard, it was heard by at least the two sources. It wasn't separated. To Dr. Davis's credit, when I was working through discs, he and I were discussing this halo issue, and he said, "Josh, that's a possible propulsion thing. Code it, consider coding it like that." And so, again, I'm not a physicist, not a material scientist. I mean, I'm going to take the word of the expert on how to observe that. And so the halo around the discs, which was frequent, coded as possible propulsion, and it glows. Both the propulsion and the disc glow separate from each other, but if that halo is present, the halo glows. Average size, roughly 75 feet in diameter. And when I say average, let me rephrase that. Most reported size was 75 feet in diameter. There would be anti-gravity to hypersonic movement, so that stasis to speed is still there. It was emitting beams as well, random light pulsations, and there appeared to be portals. Also prone to radar detection, tended to stick around after being detected by radar, as opposed to triangles that would move away. Discernible physical features, a light band. It would have a light band around what we would call the middle of the disc where the two concave plates meet. Would have a red light on the top of it that would blink, or on top of the dome. And it was typically made of two concave plates. These stuck around on average 15 to 30 minutes. So again, this calls into question this idea of collective pathology. There's enough time for the brain to sort what it's seeing, right? And these are the 684 cases that I maintained and held and used of at least two sources. So two people saw this thing, or the person and an object, if the disc was present, it was having an effect on whatever that object was for that 15 to 30 minute window. Collective pathology? Weather balloon? I don't know. There's trace evidence. It would distort a radio signal, and it often emitted some sort of electromagnetic aspect that created issues with whatever electronic capabilities there were in that area. And often seen by trained observers, military and pilots often encountered discs. Okay, all disc cases tends to be a little bit more proliferated than the triangle. There were 152 disc cases, if I remember correctly. And again, when I look at the gaps on this map, as a intel professional, the first thing I say is lack of reporting. That's typically what happens first. Is okay. These are all areas where we need to try and gather more data to see if is it hyper concentrated on one area, or are we more likely to report in the U.S. Okay, reported disc encounters, massive spike. The year of the UFO, 1952, when most discs are reported. And then we see it drops off, there's a decline, and then it bumps up in the 2000s, right? Interestingly enough, there appears to be a correlation between, in the 2000s with the Nimitz encounter and the increase at that time. And these ones also, they don't, I wouldn't say discs tend to be observed more at night. Well, let me phrase that. I wouldn't say that they take a liking to the nighttime like the triangles. I would say that although the preponderance of cases reported occur at night, there's still a steady amount that moves on through the day as well. So, if we're going to make some logical leaps here, it could very well be that the light distortion of the disc is causing the reason for why they appear to be observed at night. But again, not a physicist. That's when I ask my physicist friends what that means. All right, these are the combined shapes. This one is a little bit harder to define because this included 8, 9 different forms of shapes, But again, these were reported between 1 and 60 times per shape that went into the combined shapes group. And so in that regard, I had to focus at the analysis on what common signatures within these categories we can state that when people say that they see a cigar or a sphere or a cone, trapezoid, rectangle, what they're seeing. So some signatures were removed off of this because maybe only trapezoids had it, right? And so the goal here was to limit this to what was observed within that particular category. What's interesting here is that with these combined shapes, specifically spheres, there's a physiological response. Cancer's been reported, radiation sickness and burns, autoimmune diseases. Also, spheres in general appear to be able to just manifest in areas. You'll see them outside a building and then it manifests in your car. Or you'll see it outside of your car and then it manifests in your car. Strange. I don't know, again, using what is reported and how those reports met curation standard is to those individuals that happened to, they then went and got treated for autoimmune diseases they didn't have before. That's a data point. It may not be causation, but it's still a data point. And these tend to be reported a little bit more proliferated, a little bit in more areas. And this is when they're most often to be reported. Again, I'm going to jump to time of occurrence. These combined shapes tend to focus mainly on, or they tend to be observed at night, most likely. Okay, unidentified submersible phenomena, right? These are cases that I extrapolated at the end of when I finished all data collection, went through all the analysis, and I'm getting ready to wrap it up, and I sit down with my committee to pitch them on where I am. Question gets asked, what about the ocean? I said, yes, what about the ocean? I wish I would have thought of that when I began the study. So what I did is I went back to those cases that met curation standards and I extrapolated those that had some sort of interaction with water, may have originated around water, and this is what came out of it. This is either an origination at water or some sort of activity at it. So if you look at some of these, especially if you look down at the Wivenhoe Dam, Australia, it agitated the water. Below that, at Newmarket, Ontario, sucked water. The Nimitz encounter, it roiled water. So there's some sort of action with water occurring. And that's important, especially in light of research starting to focus on these submersible phenomena. Okay, so these are my conclusions that were derived from my findings. UAP presents signatures which are detectable and measurable. It's manifesting in our understanding of the material properties of Earth, universe, whatever. It's manifesting here. We can observe it, we can see it, we can detect it. It's not a collective pathology, and it doesn't just happen to military people, right? That's key. Technical capabilities often validate human observation. We often state, well, where's the radar data? Where's the IR data, these multimodal sensor arrays? Well, we don't have a lot of them, right? But even then, in UAP reports, these technical collection means that were used often validated the encounter. They rarely initiated, right? So somebody would see something, then the radar would detect it or IR would pick it up, right? So conclusion 2 is key in letting us know that we should not rule out the human sensor. Yes, eyewitness testimony can be unreliable, but however, it still can be used as a trigger. Signatures from 1940s are similar to now. There hasn't been much of a shift. That's pretty important when we're looking at how we approach the phenomena, because I don't know how far back we would need to go to see when there is a shift in signatures, but when we look at what happened in the 1940s to now, it answers a lot of those, or it calls into question a lot of those questions that we're skeptics will look at us and say, well, how do you account for this? Well, the data sets, are pointing to it. It's not me. The physiological response, that occurs when people encounter UAP is similar to exposure to radiation. That was frequently reported, and it wasn't that they would know they had radiation. They go to the doctor and they'd be like, oh wow, that's like, I need to put a Geiger counter on you, my gosh, right? And so that's what was happening. Number 5, it coincides with finding 2. Human observation initiates most reporting, right? So somebody's gonna see something and then typically the technical collect fires up. Rarely is it the other way around. The encounters occur, and predominantly here, it can seem kind of skewed with UAPs encounters occurring predominantly at both civilian areas and national security sites. But when you look at the globe's big, right? So I got a lot of areas that were depicted on my map that there's a lot of gaps, right? So we don't know if they're originating from the ocean. It could be. We don't have a lot of stuff floating around in the ocean, or we don't have static populations in the ocean to tell us if that's happening. But, it can seem kind of, pretty self-explanatory. But in the end, it's important to know that it's not only focused on civilians. It's not only focused on national security locations. Signatures, when I started this, I hypothesized 12, it went to 42. 42 different ways people are observing and reporting these encounters. And they're transient, right? There's some anecdotal evidence that points to cluster areas. Again, I don't have enough data that met curation standard to address the cluster areas. So at this point, I have to declare that they're transient. They appear to be in multiple areas, over a course of time. All right, so recommendations to policymakers. Nominate UAP to National Intelligence Priority Framework. That will ensure that the U.S. intelligence community actively pursues unidentified anomalous phenomena. We have laws that have already stated that this needs to happen, so we can check that one. Add UAP as a 9th category of classified national security information. In that particular statement, what we have is if we classify it as a 9th category, that means that we can share it with our international partners, right? So what data we get in the government, we can now share with other governments to figure out what this problem is, right? Establish a government integration program. Like the topic of this year's conference is how do we bridge the gap between government, science, academia, right? How do we bring people together to look at this problem, right? Start an integration program. National Academy of the Sciences, I think that's the one that offers the grants for various research topics. This can be a research topic, and money could be allotted to look at this problem that way. And keep UAP remaining as a reportable item to Congress every 180 days. For the Homeland Security, make UAP part of the quadrennial Homeland Security Review. What this security review does is every 4 years, Homeland Security is required to report to both Congress and the President what the risk and the threats are to the United States. And when we look at cases with UAP that are occurring in the United States, we have some issues with physiological responses that are not necessarily positive. So if we start looking at it as a legitimate problem, we don't have to say threat, but that it poses a risk, then we can start using the tools that we have at our disposal to address that risk. Evaluate corollaries between UAP encounters and Tier 1 critical infrastructure nodes. So when we say critical infrastructure nodes, those are the things that the Homeland Security has nominated as being necessary, and necessary I don't think is the right word, because it already says critical on the slide, but these are those areas in the U.S. or these venues in the U.S. that if they were to be disabled, it would render our country to a halt, right? So are there, DHS has a means of being able to evaluate this, and so they can, and that's something that they could look at doing. And integrate UAP reporting into fusion centers. So fusion centers are clearinghouses. It's something that was implemented after 9/11 as a way to try and flatten the operational picture, to identify threat and then mitigate the risk and prevent threat issues within the U.S. And so if we use fusion centers that way, it keeps that data going around the U.S. and it offers more analytical capability to look at it. Okay, recommendations to practitioners. Identify behavioral characteristics and signatures. I believe we've already had a couple presentations that states that, yes, it does offer characteristics, and so there is something else to do with looking at this problem. So we can further refine characteristics, signatures, attributes of UAP, which may help inform other various aspects of the problem. Develop and maintain a curation criteria. We can't keep just allowing stuff to go into a database and checking it off and calling it a UFO or a UAP, right? So have a curation standard, try and implement that curation standard. A lot of tools out there that can help with that. And so we should look at trying to make that happen. And then point 3, A and B, establish a standard reporting process and include the fundamental elements of UAP. And so when I say fundamental elements, that means what it is that we can define when we say UAP, because that's essentially the baseline standard, and it can shift, right? So we can't be married to definitions, and so if we see a shift, we have to know that the fundamental element of an unidentified, anomalous, or aerospace phenomena can shift. Right? Collect physical evidence at the event. This seems self-explanatory, rarely happens, right? Rarely happens. And then after it's collected, if it is, there's no chain of custody. It goes to someone who has a buddy who checks it. There's no record of how it got to the location, so we don't know if it's been tampered, and that can also create some issues. And then analyzes UAP occurrences to focus efforts. And what I mean by that is, we have a lot of reporting, we have a technical capability, there's a means to bring those two together, and if we look at the data sets that we have to find cluster areas, then we might have locations to where we can use multimodal sensor arrays. Okay, this is a recommended reporting process that, if I were, again, unlimited resources, unlimited people, this is essentially how I would set something up. An event occurs, the investigator conducts the interviews and collects the evidence. They write 3 reports. They write the informational report. That is factual data, right? Event X happened here, right? It was reported to be X, Y, Z, A, B, C, right? And then those signatures from whatever go into the database. The next report they write is the operational report. This is the narrative of the interview. This is when you tell, how receptive was the source of information, the personality of the individual, just tell us about how that interview went, because what that does is it also speaks to the reliability of the source as well. And then on the end, report collected evidence, right? So when I have a template set up for what that looks like to collect evidence and how to maintain a chain of custody, right? And then after that, you can take all that and you move it into the databases to build a UAP profile and focus collection efforts, right? So what that does is this iterative process, you can enhance your interviews, and then you can also use multimodal sensor deployment. Deploying a multimodal sensor array is expensive. Just ask UAPX. It's really expensive to move that thing around, right? So what if we standardize how we collect data from from the human sensor, then then companies like UAPX don't have to go out with a wild shot in the dark to figure out where to go, because they can look at data sets and go, you know what, there's a cluster area here. We don't know if it's weather balloons, we don't know what it is, but hey, this might be an area we can go, put this in a field and see what happens, right? And then what that does is it informs further analysis, right? And then you just keep refining this process over and over and over, and then soon, maybe we can solve the problem. All right, so here's a brief snapshot of the reporting templates. This is in the back of my dissertation. On top of that, if you'd like a copy of what these look like, I can send to you. I tried to make them fillable forms, but essentially it goes through, it'll walk you through how to, what it is that again, if I were in charge, what I'd be looking for, right? The information report on the left, it gives you, the data you would need to frame out the UAP. The interview report on the right is when you tell us about, what happened in the interview, how it went, were they receptive to future contact? Do they not want to be declared that they're reporting this? That's also fine. You can start, blacking stuff out so that way you're not, reporting something that they don't want to know. And then the administrative report, this is where you would talk about the evidence you collected, start the chain of custody, and then, what it took to get out there, those data points that that would be important when you look down the line to possible future collection. All right, and here's the recommendations to researchers. Identify signatures across time, location, and duration. Again, looking at our current databases, they don't do this. And so as we refine the databases, we'll be able to extrapolate these and conduct analysis based off of these key points. Integrate the human sensor. The sensor can trigger scientific data collection, right? It's done often, and it's something that we can also integrate. Apply structured analytic techniques to evaluate UAP data and information, right? There's key data points that wicked smart scientists have already told me since I've been here that are instrumental to further analyzing this problem, right? And so as I'm looking at it and I have them walk up and they go, hey, did you know this? No, I didn't, but my gosh, is that important? And I would love to get that included. So that way, as we're refining what we're looking at UAP, it triggers us to know what we're going after. So instead of just saying, yeah, they saw X, we can go, nope, this is what this means. These are the questions you need to ask when you go extrapolate data from that person. Okay, and that's how this process is supposed to work. UAP groups adopt an information gathering and analysis strategy, right? Having a website that just accepts in reports is not a strategy, right? How are you going to curate that? And I get where a lot of us are volunteers as we look at this problem, and so that may be one of those insurmountable ones. But as we're looking at this problem, right, coming up with a strategy to how to take in data, how to parse it, how to curate it, and then how we get it into the analytical process is extremely important. With that being said, I have 3 takeaways that I'd like to present. The first one is we can observe and categorize the phenomena, which means that based off of what we have in our current databases, it is possible to develop a taxonomy. Secondly, the scientific process, meaning that it is, when I say that, I mean devoid of a hypothesis, because I couldn't start with a hypothesis, offers an innovative way of looking at UAP data and analyzing it. Thirdly, if we combine the human sensor with technical collection capabilities, it can also achieve that ends even better because now we're enjoined with our material scientists who know how to better frame what it is we're looking at, so that way when we go out to conduct our interviews, we know what we're asking a lot better. We're refining our question sets over and over and over. And fourthly, and this speaks to when Dr. Knuth presented Carl Sagan's, what I would say, zeitgeist at the time, extraordinary evidence is ordinary evidence collected and analyzed over time, right? And so we have to understand that when we say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, all extraordinary evidence is, especially to me in the field that I'm in, is just ordinary evidence done over, that we just analyze and we refine, we analyze and we refine, right? That is how we're able to inform our key judgments. That is how we are able to give our analytical probabilities, and that's how we're able to inform our policymakers. With that being said, I'm Joshua Pierson. Thank you for your time.